Welcome to Race, Justice, and Immigration, our In Search of Shalom Race and Justice book discussion series. It's a monthly gathering where we discuss race and justice in today's world and discover the important role each of us plays in seeking justice and restoring shalom. This series is jointly sponsored by the Black Scholars and Professionals Unit and the Pacific Area Region of InterVarsity's Graduate and Faculty Ministry. My name is Gloria, and I am one of the volunteer organizers. The United States calls itself a nation of immigrants, but there were people living here before the first immigrants arrived. As Spanish colonizers around 1565, quickly followed by the British and other Europeans, with Africans imported as slaves from around 1619, Mexicans arrived in present-day New Mexico around 1598. Most of us live on land that once belonged to the First Nation peoples of North America. So this evening, even as we learn about and work toward justice in immigration, we are called to fight against the injustice that was and continues to be done to those who first called this land home. I'd like to invite Dr. Denise Thompson, National Director of the Black Scholars and Professionals of InterVarsity, together with Megan Krishke, National Director of InterVarsity's Native Ministries, and Orlando Crespo, National Director of InterVarsity's Latino Fellowship, to pray for our session.
Thank you, Gloria. It's been my privilege to work alongside an amazing group of BSAP, Black Scholars and Professionals staff, volunteers, graduate faculty ministry and Black campus ministry colleagues and alumni in listening for God's heart. Those are the exact words one of our faculty said, describing what we do in BSAP, listen for God's heart in InterVarsity. The mission is to see this generation of Black scholars, professionals, graduate students, and faculty transformed by Jesus, renewed in their academic pursuits and professional callings to become agents of transformation, redeeming influencers in the academy, the community, the church, and the world. So I want you to be sure to ask me more about how you can partner with us in prayer at the end of this session. But for tonight, as we prepare our hearts for prayer to listen for God's heart about race, justice, and immigration, we take a moment to recognize and honor our Native brothers and sisters as the first peoples of these lands we call home.
Hoyo Mataru, Megan Krishke Ajetsa, Wendat Aja Tuten. Hello, friends. My name is Megan Murdoch Krishke. I'm a member of the Wyandotte Nation, originally at the New York-Canada border, currently here in Northeast Oklahoma. And I live in what we now call Tulsa, Oklahoma, which is on the traditional land of the Osage people, as well as a number of other tribes, including the Wichita and Caddo. The Osage have inhabited these lands for over 2,000 years, and Creator made from one man every nation of mankind to live in all of the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place, that they should seek God. As Native nations, we also believe these words and sense the benevolent hand of the Creator in our dwelling place, our homelands, and have sought them just as Paul says. Our connection to the land, as in Old Testament times, is spiritual and not just circumstantial. We have not experienced peaceful interactions with the waves of immigrants who ultimately displaced us. The violence, the broken treaties are sins, not just against us, but against the God who established us here, our Creator.
When sin occurs, both parties, sinners and the ones sinned against, need God's healing. As a country, we realize that the sin of slavery has long-reaching consequences for everyone. Similarly, we're beginning to see that sins against Native people matter too. The winners still benefit, the losers still suffer. And the causes of it all in our hearts are not going away. A good place to start then is moving into God's grace is by seeing and honoring our Native brothers and sisters, especially those whose lands we're presently on.
So following cues from Native traditions and led in prayer by Sister Megan, we will see and honor our Native brothers and sisters whose lands we are on. Please mute your mics and join in the protocol prayer up on the screen now, using the name of the tribe, which you originally found in the land of the zip code when we did the menti.com, in place of Megan's use of Osage for her home.
Creator God, thank you for the
Olodi people.
Forgive us, those of us who are immigrants to settle to and settlers in this country, for so often forgetting that we are guests of the First Nations people of North America.
These lands with respect.
We pray for the Osage people today.
Creator, hear our prayers.
May they have unity in their tribe.
Creator, hear our prayers.
May their remaining sacred lands be honored and protected.
Creator, hear our prayers.
May you bless their efforts.
May you bless their efforts to revitalize their language and their culture.
Creator, hear our prayers.
May we and all the people who live in and visit these lands remember that we are all guests.
Creator, hear our prayers.
May all the Osage people know that they are loved by a good and powerful Creator.
Creator, hear our prayers.
Creator
of every tribe,
nation,
and tongue, may you richly bless the first people of our land
and richly bless
us tonight. Amen.
Thank you, Dr. Denise, Miss Megan, and Mr. Orlando. Amen and amen. So everyone, you might be wondering why we included immigration in our discussion series on race and justice and how immigration is connected to shalom. Shalom is God's perfect plan for creation, the forceful goodness of our relationship with God, ourselves, the environment, and others. With shalom, everyone is treated according to their inherent dignity as those bearing the image of God. Jesus came to reestablish God's kingdom and restore shalom, and he invites us to partner in this mission. Throughout history, humans have organized themselves in man-made nation states, affording special rights to those who have met specific criteria within invisible borders. God has repeatedly admonished his people to welcome strangers and be kind to foreigners, keeping in mind that at one time we were all foreigners. God invited the entire world to an inheritance once offered exclusively to Jews. He models a borderless, boundaryless love. In the United States, God's mandate to welcome the stranger is powerfully applicable. Over 98% of American citizens are descended from people who immigrated here. Yet xenophobia, or the fear or hatred of foreigners, is rampant and most often aimed at non-white people from Hispanic, African, Caribbean, and Asian countries. Immigrants from these countries face legal exclusion, racial and ethnic profiling and stereotyping, and physical attacks. Our God-given dignity is disregarded, and the image of God is disrespected. Furthermore, this broken shalom is apparent in the recent rise of violent attacks on Asians and Asian Americans within our borders. The recent storms throughout Texas and the Southwest have disproportionately affected immigrants and refugees who may not know what resources are available and language barriers make accessing them more difficult. As a nation of immigrants, we have a mandate to embody kingdom love on earth as it is in heaven. When we extend our resources, care, friendship, and protection to the strangers who join us, we honor the salam that God has given each of us. We restore right relationship between people and between ethnic groups and partner with God in ushering shalom. As mentioned earlier, my name is Gloria Darko. I'm from the Bronx, New York, and I work as an admission counselor at my alma mater, Susquehanna University. I graduated with an international studies degree, and immigration is the topic I was most interested in. As a daughter of immigrants, I often heard about issues that affected immigrants, but I realized I didn't really know much about immigration policies in the United States. The summer after my first year of college, I had an opportunity to intern and work with Latino children and their families in the Washington, D.C. and Virginia areas. It was through that internship that I became much more educated about undocumented populations and policies I often heard on the news like DACA. Over the years, I realized that America has had a history of xenophobia, as I mentioned before, the fear and hatred of foreigners. For this month's discussion, I read America for Americans, A History of Xenophobia in the United States, a book by Erica Lee. She shows how even though the United States is known as a nation of immigrants, it is also a nation of xenophobia. Lee argues that xenophobia is an American tradition that is deeply embedded in our society, economy, and politics. Some important statistics I learned from Lee's book is that more than 80 million immigrants have arrived in the last 200 years, and the United States has led the world in resettling refugees, which is approximately 3 million people since 1980. Even though the United States has welcomed millions from around the world, it has deported over 55 million people since 1882, which is more than any other nation. Historically, immigrants have been labeled because they were poor, practiced a different faith, and were non-white.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ray Michelle, and I've been a witness to the African-American experience of half of my family who are descendants of involuntary immigration here in the United States, and the complexities of immigration that some of the other half has experienced. This month, I watched Immigration Nation on Netflix. Through interviews with ICE agents, detainees, undocumented immigrants, and their families, both here and abroad, activists, lawyers, Mexican cartel employees, and American citizens, the filmmakers show how the government has created increasingly strict regulations and difficult conditions to deter people from entering the United States, including family separation, indeterminate detention times at centers, increased militarization of the border, which funnels people into the most dangerous terrain, increasing the prices the cartel can charge, and rapidly increasing the death rates of immigrants, from 15 to 20 people a year in the 90s to over 3,000 unknown deaths at the Arizona border alone in 2019. Once here, people can face fear of detection, unethical practices by law enforcement officials, wage theft from employers who specifically hire undocumented people, knowing that they won't go to authorities. Legal residents can have their status stripped for minor nonviolent offenses, resulting in a deported veteran community. And undocumented women and children rarely report their abusers. All of this was marked by a cavalier attitude in our government officials and mirrored in the American public. I struggled seeing what seemed to be a lack of empathy and understanding of the difficulty and longevity of a legal immigration process. All this to enter a nation filled with descendants of those who arrived on this shore without any documentation, relying on the generosity and benevolence of those already here.
Thank you, Ray Michelle, for that overview of Immigration Nation. Hi, everyone. My name is Gabrielle Samuel. I was born in Trinidad, but I currently live in Rochester, New York. I've also lived in Arlington, Virginia, St. Louis, Missouri, Ghana, and the Dominican Republic. So I know how precarious being a foreigner can feel, but I've also experienced welcome and hospitality. And tonight, I'm excited to learn how I can extend that to other immigrants. In welcoming the stranger, Justice, Compassion, and Truth in the Immigration Debate, Matthew Soren's and Jenny Yang illuminate the American immigration system and Christians' biblical response. Economic desperation, war, persecution, and family separation push people towards the United States. Most who enter or stay unlawfully do so because without substantial education or financial resources, they cannot access paths to legal residency. But immigrants substantially benefit American society. They expand jobs, stimulate businesses, model strong family values, and expand Christians' opportunities to spread the gospel. However, regardless of the reasons for or effects of their presence, Christians are mandated to care for immigrants as neighbors made in God's image. Christians are called to pray for them, give to advocacy and relief organizations, befriend immigrant neighbors, and advocate for comprehensive immigration reform. We must engage in bipartisan cooperation to advocate for reform that addresses national security, economic interests, and cultural interests, while respecting the human dignity of every immigrant.
Thank you so much, Gabby. Hi, everyone. My name is Star Gibson, and I'm a recent master's graduate of the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Originally, I'm from East St. Louis, Illinois, and I'm excited to be here today. The article that I read today was Jesus Was a Refugee by the SALT Project, written in 2019. The central theme of this article is that Jesus was and is a refugee. At the start of his life, his family fled away from Bethlehem to Egypt. They went to seek refuge. This young refugee grows up to be a teacher that's well acquainted with scripture. And as we've heard already, Christians are called to serve the least of these. We can do this by feeding the hungry and welcoming the stranger. Instead of running from refugees, we should run towards them and help them. In college, I went to cultural centers on campus, and I heard about the student struggles that a lot of students face. I learned about DACA immigration policy, the deferred action for childhood arrivals. It wasn't until then that I found out that students did not have access to federal student loans. I know that this may not be everyone's story, but through learning about their stories, this made me want to learn and help any way that I could. That's why I'm excited to be here today.
Thank you, Star. So immigration is a complex issue, as mentioned in all of our summaries. It involves national security, economics, sociology, and so much more. However, at its core, immigration is about people. People move through the world for safety, family, and dignity. Tonight, we share the story of my friend Daniela Bushiri, a senior chemical engineering major at New Jersey Institute of Technology, who will share her experience as a refugee immigrating from the Democratic Republic of the Congo. I had the honor of meeting her at Urbana 2018 InterVarsity Student Mission Conference.
Hello everyone, my name is Daniela Bushiri. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to share my story with all of you, and I hope that you engaged with it, and also if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. So for the longest time, I never knew how it felt like to call a place home or to truly belong to a place. And that is because when I was 1 year old, my family had to flee a war from our home country, which is Congo. It was during the Second Congo War, which is one of the deadliest wars in Congo. And we fled that war and we sought asylum in South Africa. We traveled to South Africa by foot, so we just went border by border, catching boats, catching trains, catching buses until we got to South Africa. Once we reached South Africa, we got refugee status in South Africa. So a refugee is someone who flees from natural oppression, political oppression, or a war. And so in my family's case, because we fled the war in South Africa, we were given refugee status. And so like I mentioned in the beginning, it was really hard for me to feel like I belong to a place, because once as a refugee in South Africa, it was really hard to assimilate and fully develop an identity, because people would always remind me that I didn't belong there, and they would tell me things like, go back to where you came from, you don't belong here, people like you are stealing our jobs, are stealing our women, are stealing our resources, go back to where you came from. And then also I never really got to fully understand my Congolese identity growing up, because there wasn't a lot of Congolese people where I grew up. And so growing up in South Africa, like I said, people would, verbally abuse us. But then in 2008, there was a xenophobic attack on refugees, which means that these South African citizens started looting and destroying refugee-owned businesses, refugee homes. They were even killing some refugees in the streets and stuff like that. So our lives became in danger. It was almost a deja vu moment from running away from a war to seek refuge in a safe place, only to experience a similar type of violence while living there. And so my family and I, in 2008, had to leave our home and move to a refugee camp in order to stay safe, because there we were protected by the police and the UN. And that is when my mom applied for resettlement program. So resettlement program is a program that takes refugees from their host countries to another host country that's more receptive of refugees, because South Africa was deemed unsafe for refugees at that time. So finally in 2016, my family moved to the United States of America through the United Nations Resettlement Program. And finally, I was able to find a place whereby I could call home. Once I moved to New Jersey, I found a community of people who were very open to just being receptive to people from outside of the country. Nobody told me to go back where I came from. I found a community of people that accepted me for who I am, and I saw that I could grow and fully develop an identity here. So that is my story. Thank you so much for listening, and yeah, bye.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing your story, Daniela. So as we continue to investigate this issue, let's remember the people whose lives we are discussing. Tonight, we are delighted to listen in on a panel conversation on immigration. We are honored to have with us Dean Kevin Johnson, Mr. Elket Rodriguez, and one of our own InterVarsity alums, Dr. Jung Bae. Dr. Bae will moderate the discussion with Dean Johnson and Mr. Rodriguez, and then we'll get to ask the panelists questions through the chat. Our moderator, Dr. Jung Bae, is a labor economist with research experience in the economics of immigration and the economics of science and innovation. Born in Seoul, South Korea, Dr. Bae studied economics and mathematics at the University of Washington, received his master's in economics from The Ohio State University in 2015, and was awarded a PhD in economics from the Ohio State University in 2020. Thank you, Dr. Jung Bae, for being with us. I'll leave it to you to introduce our speakers for tonight.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Gloria, and good evening, everyone. Thanks for, by the way, capitalizing the Ohio State University, or emphasizing that. I certainly appreciate that. But as you've just heard, I am myself an immigrant from South Korea who ended up taking an academic interest in immigration as well. And although I've since pursued a career in industry and I'm no longer in academia, immigration remains an issue that's really near and dear to my heart. And so I'm very glad to be a part of this discussion tonight, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. So with that tonight, we'll be hearing from our two panelists, each delivering their remarks as well as in a Q&A to follow. First, it's my honor to introduce Kevin R. Johnson, who is the Dean and maybe a Paulus Professor of Public Interest Law at UC Davis Law, and a Professor of Chicana and Chicano Studies. He has taught immigration law, Latinos and Latinas in the law, and critical race theory, and has published extensively on immigration law and civil rights. His books, How Did You Get to Be Mexican? A White and Brown Man's Search for Identity, and Immigration Law and the US-Mexico Border have been highly awarded. Of Mexican-American ancestry, he is the first Latino to head a law school in the UC system. So Dean Johnson, the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I'm very pleased to talk and discuss race, justice, and immigration, which in my mind, together really amount to one of the most important civil rights issues of the 21st century. Unfortunately, and we heard about this when we were briefed on Erica Lee's wonderful book, There's a long history of anti-immigrant, anti-foreigner sentiment in the United States. In fact, the first major federal immigration law was known officially as the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. And its primary goal was to keep Chinese out of the United States. And it followed a very horrible period of many years where Chinese immigrants who came here initially to build the Transcontinental Railroad were basically terrorized by local populations, particularly in the West, especially in California. And the issue was basically one of race and economics. After the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, the nation saw an economic downturn. There was a growth in anti-Chinese sentiment, in part claims that those people are different racially, linguistically, religiously, culturally, and they don't belong, and they'll work for inhumane wages that true white Americans won't work for. And when I say violent, there were violent rampages in some Western towns where basically the Chinese parts of town were burnt down. There's a deep and truly horrible history, and in many states in the West in particular, of this terrorism of Chinese people. And in the end, Congress was convinced to pass a series of laws that were designed to keep Chinese people and later all Asian people from the United States. And for those Chinese immigrants who had come here, the law made it impossible for them to become citizens because they were non-white. So it was like a permanent caste of Chinese immigrants who, if they made it to the United States, were forced to be non-citizens. And the Supreme Court at the time upheld all these laws and basically immunized all immigration laws from any kind of constitutional review. In that, the case that decided that was known as the Chinese Exclusion Case. That's the official name. It upheld the Chinese Exclusion Act and said basically that Congress can do anything with respect to non-citizens seeking admission to the United States. And this led to a series of immigration laws that have discriminated against racial minorities, against women, against political minorities, against the disabled persons and the infirm, and a whole wide, gays and lesbians, a whole wide variety of groups, and there being no judicial relief. If you want to see a sort of modern instance of the Supreme Court upholding a policy based on no judicial review, you can look at the Muslim ban that the Trump administration put into place and the Supreme Court upheld with very minimal constitutional review. So throughout US history, besides the discriminatory immigration laws, you also see other enforcement efforts that are really based on race. Two examples I'll give are, and this is not an instance that's very well known, but during the Great Depression, about 1 million persons of Mexican ancestry, immigrants as well as natural born citizens, were forcibly removed from the United States and taken to Mexico. Many of them rounded up in public places, put on buses and trains, and taken to the border and let off at the border. That instance, the idea was we should get rid of immigrants, save our public benefits for real Americans, and we won't pay as much attention as we should to whether or not we're deporting citizens or not. Another instance of sort of racial animosity run amok is what is known officially as Operation Wetback in 1954, when the US government conducted basically a military operation in the Southwest, removing Mexican workers and US citizens as well of Mexican ancestry, and also, in the end, removing about a million people. Now, some things changed for the better in 1965 when the Civil Rights Revolution came to immigration law. And there was a law passed, the Immigration Act of 1965, that eliminated the blatant anti-Asian, anti-Chinese exclusions in the immigration laws. It made the laws what are called colorblind and race neutral. At the same time, Congress added some provisions that really affect people of color dramatically. And one example I'll give you, there are these things called per country ceilings. That basically means that only 75,000 people from any one nation can come in a particular year. What that means is that people from Mexico, the Philippines, India, and China have to wait many years because there's a lot of people in those countries who want to come lawfully to the United States. And so if you want to get an immigrant visa from those countries, you can apply, you can be granted one, but you can be put in a line where you have to wait 5, 10, 15, 20 years to rejoin family. I worked on a case a few years ago involving an undocumented immigrant who wanted to become an attorney. Good news is we won the case. The bad news was that he had been waiting for a visa since 1994. And when the California Supreme Court decided his case, it was 2014. And he still hadn't been issued a visa because the waits for people from Mexico were so long that he wasn't eligible to be issued one. So these per country ceilings, which apply the same to each and every nation, so that Mexico has the same limit as Iceland does. Iceland never meets its limit, but Mexico does every year. Create these impossible lines for some people seeking to rejoin family. And it tends to affect people of color from the developing world. Now, today, I could talk a lot about President Trump's approach to immigration, but there's some basic facts that should be kept in mind. Even though the laws are neutrally enforced, 90% of the people removed every year are Latino, primarily from Mexico and Central America. Mass detention has been used by the federal government. Most of those people subject to detention, and we've set record numbers of detentions in recent years. Most of the people detained are Central Americans. The family separation policy doesn't talk about race, saying that they're going to separate families coming here, but it was enforced primarily against Mexicans and Central Americans. We know this really isn't a mistake, and President Trump, when he's in office, rarely vilified immigrants in certain ways that I won't repeat because I don't talk about people like that. But he sure did. It was clear that race was at the bottom of one of his concerns. There have been attacks on what some people denigrate as chain migration, which really is family-based migration, where people want to reunite with family here. It has been alleged that it's primarily used by people of color. It is used by many people of color seeking to come to this country. And the attacks on chain migration really are an attempt to limit the migration of people of color to the country. There's also been attacks on anchor babies, or as I would put it, attacks on what's known as birthright citizenship. That is, if you're born in this country, you're a US citizen. It's a clear rule that I think is a good rule that makes it clear that anybody born in US territory, whatever the immigration status of their parents, is a US citizen. It's easy to enforce. It's relatively clear to all. Very few disputes about birthright citizenship arise. But some people want to do away with that because I think of the fact that so many, or they believe so many people, children of undocumented parents, are able to get citizenship. Now, one of the things I'll mention, and I think it's very important to me, is that in talking about our immigration laws, people oftentimes don't talk about the humanity of the people affected by the laws. And there's a comprehensive immigration reform bill that the Biden administration is supporting. And one of the things that it does is it removes the term, quote, alien from the immigration laws, and it replaces it with the term non-citizens. And the way we use terms affects how we treat people. If we dehumanize people by calling them aliens or illegal aliens, then it's easier to say they don't have any rights, family separation's okay. They don't have any rights, it's okay to remove them and tear them apart from family, friends, and community. So I think this terminology question is a very important one as we try to understand and treat people with dignity and humanity. I agree wholeheartedly that immigration is a very complicated issue, but it's also a very human issue, and we should be sensitive in how we try to approach it. And one of the things I think that bothers me the most about the last 4 years is there was no effort to be sensitive to the various issues at stake, and there were attacks on aliens and illegal aliens and others who I view as people deserving of humanity and respect. We have an immigration clinic at UC Davis that provides assistance to non-citizens. Some of them are seeking asylum from persecution. Some of them are seeking DACA and relief from removal. And others are seeking other forms of relief from removal. And I've attended a number of Know Your Rights sessions in communities across the state of California. One of the things I can say that people, immigrant communities, are truly scared to death, or were scared to death, but I think still are scared to death of what can happen to them through the immigration system. When you see people cry, worrying about their kids, too afraid to take their children to a doctor or go to church or go to school sometimes because of their worry about getting arrested and deported, you get a real sense of what the human impacts of immigration are. And I think we should pay attention to those. But let me stop there, and I look forward to the questions, and I'll try to give some answers.
Thank you, Dean Johnson. I really appreciate that you gave the sort of historical context and the contours of the exclusive immigration policies and how their origins and how their enforcement have interacted with race. And I think it's really important for us to sort of understand how we got to where we are today, and how that has shaped the policy environment of today and the realities of immigrants that some of which you highlighted. So thank you again. Let me now introduce our second panelist, Mr. Elket Rodriguez. Mr. Rodriguez was born and raised in Puerto Rico and is now based in West Texas. He holds a BA in journalism and a law degree from the University of Puerto Rico, and is pursuing a Master of Divinity from the B.H. Carroll Theological Institute. Mr. Rodriguez has worked for various law firms, Child Protective Services, the Christian Missionary Alliance, and the First Baptist Church of Midland, where he served as a family and senior adult ministry assistant, teacher of citizenship classes, and English as a second language consultant. He also established a thriving Spanish Sunday school ministry. Mr. Rodriguez currently serves as an immigrant and refugee specialist for Cooperative Baptist Fellowship. Mr. Rodriguez, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. And first, I want to thank InterVarsity Christian Fellowship for this opportunity and for creating a space where Christians can talk about the intersectionality of faith, race, justice, and immigration. To understand immigration policy today and how it interacts with race, faith, and justice, you must first understand that laws and policies are ways to protect interests, not necessarily to promote justice. And I learned that in law school. Laws are more political, sometimes immoral, in certain areas of our legal system, and immigration laws are not exempt from that. Racial and religious prejudice has always been at the heart of US immigration laws. After conducting its first census, Congress approved the Naturalization Act of 1790, limiting citizenship through naturalization to free white persons of good character, excluding everybody else. That racial bias set the tone for our immigration laws and enforcement until today. For centuries, US immigration laws have targeted different racial and religious groups, protecting the interests of white Americans and their right to own property. To give some examples are the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act that has already been mentioned by Professor Johnson. African Americans who were involuntary immigrants brought as slaves to the United States were not considered American citizens until the ratification of the 14th Amendment in July 1868. After the ratification, segregation followed. In 1920s, uh, in the 1920s, Congress enacted the quota system to curtail immigration from East and Southern Europe, relying on eugenics, which is the practice of improving the human species by selectively mating with specific desirable hereditary traits. In fact, Adolf Hitler praised that US policy model and approach in his book Mein Kampf. It wasn't until 1952 when the law explicitly prohibited racial and gender discrimination in the naturalization process. But racial and religious discrimination did not end there. With Africans and Asians and Europeans not leading the migrant flow to the US anymore, immigration laws moved to exclude Mexicans and Latin Americans. To have an idea, since the 1880s, which is when the US began keeping stats on deportations, the US has deported 57 million immigrants. And even though Mexicans make about half of the undocumented immigrants in US history, they account for 9 out of 10 deportees. From 1917 to 1960, Mexicans were often required to strip naked and disinfected with various chemical agents before entering the US at the southern border in what has been called the bath riots. And among the chemicals used, which has recently been exposed, was the Cyclone B gas, which was the chemical used by the Nazis to murder prisoners in the gas chambers. But today, Mexicans are not immigrating to the United States as much as they have in the past. It is mostly Central Americans. By that I mean Hondurans, Guatemalans, Salvadorans, who are showing up at our southern border, with some Cubans and Venezuelans as well, due to their current political climate. In response to this new migrant flow, the US government strengthened and built a border wall, issued travel bans, attempted to eliminate protection to DACA recipients, enacted the public charge rule, restricted visas, and dismantled the asylum process. In total, over 400 executive actions were taken during during President Trump's tenure to restrict our immigration system. Even though I can speak about each of these policies, I will try and concentrate on the two that have crushed our border communities the most. The Migrant Protection Protocols, which is the MPP, better known as the Remain in Mexico policy, that forces asylum seekers to wait outside US territory while their claims are processed in immigration courts, and the Title 42 expulsions, which allows border authorities to rapidly expel back to Mexico Hondurans, Salvadorans, and Guatemalans. Regarding the MPP, thousands of asylum seekers have been forced to live in northern Mexico for over a year, and their immigration hearings have not resumed since last year. Many of these asylum seekers live in makeshift tents with no access to running water to take a bath or clean water to drink. Imagine weathering the cold temperatures we experienced this past week inside a tent. Most of these asylum seekers depend on the donations they receive from organizations in the US for their living. Here in Matamoros, Mexico, just across the city of Brownsville, Texas, uh, stories of raped women, murdered men, exploited fathers, heartbroken mothers, and separated families are very common. These asylum seekers fled their countries with traumas only to experience more trauma. Uh, they are exposed to daily to cartel violence, but they will not share their stories, and you will not read those stories in most of the Mexican newspapers. This Friday, uh, the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, began a process to roll back the MPP, and some asylum seekers enrolled in the program are being allowed to enter the United States. Then there's Title 42, under which the US government has already expelled about 400,000 migrants since March. And this policy is still being implemented at almost every port of entry in the southern borders. And I know the stories of migrants being expelled to Mexico in stretchers with broken feet and heels because the Border Patrol does not provide them with medical assistance. And this policy is still being implemented in the meantime. The case of Black immigrants, and by Black immigrants, I mean Haitians and most immigrants that are coming from different African countries, is different. They experience discrimination by Mexican authorities, and they are held longer in detention due to language related issues and the difference in their national IDs. Black immigrants are not enrolled in the MPP or expelled through Title 42, but they are detained for months in ICE detention centers. Complaints have been filed in immigration courts by Black immigrants alleging that detention officers have withheld their food, beaten them, and used pepper spray on them for refusing to sign their deportation documents. Many Black immigrants have no access to legal representation, and they experience difficulties translating their documentary evidence to win their asylum claims. Therefore, many are deported to countries like Cameroon, South Sudan, and Mauritania that don't guarantee them basic human rights. And how have Christians responded to race, justice, and immigration? Well, we have many examples in history and today as well, but I'll give you two historical examples, one good and one bad. The bad example is the Bible riots in 1844 in Philadelphia, where nativist Protestants, alarmed by the rising Catholic population, burned two Catholic churches, killed 14 people, and injured 50, spreading the false rumor. Fake news were used back then as well. The false rumors that Catholics, mainly Irish, who were arriving to the U.S. after fleeing the Great Famine, were trying to remove the Bible from public schools. The good example is the American Baptist Churches Settlement Agreement of 1991, where the ABC filed a suit against the Immigration and Nationality Services for discriminating against Salvadorans and Guatemalans fleeing violence in their homelands during the 1980s, and new asylum cases were granted thanks to that effort. Currently, there are many Christian organizations working to protect immigrants and refugees. We in the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship do that. We normally do that not just by giving voice to what's happening and interviewing immigrants and pastors who work with immigrants, but we also do that in coalition with the Evangelical Immigration Table and the Interfaith Immigration Coalition on immigration advocacy matters. As you know, last Thursday, Congress introduced the Citizenship Act of 2021, which is the administration's proposal for immigration reform. Across denominational lines, differing theological convictions and ideological divides. In this case, when it comes to immigration reform, Christians are demonstrating remarkably consistency about the need for just and humane immigration reform. This rare level of agreement is due in large part to the consistent teaching of Scripture and the witness of Jesus Christ in the gospel. From my perspective today, the challenges we see are not across denomination, but in some of our local churches who still hold and preach that anti-immigrant sentiment. That is definitely anti-biblical and not rooted in the value of welcoming the stranger and loving our neighbors. And so I just want to end saying that to achieve shalom, we need to see God's image in every person and be the presence of God for this community who suffers greatly every day. And thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Rodriguez. It's always sobering to hear about some of the painful realities for particularly vulnerable immigrants, like at the border, and of the Black immigrants from Haiti, as you mentioned. But it's also uplifting in a sense to hear about the work of Christian organizations and advocating for a more humane, just treatment of immigration. So appreciate you sharing from your experience and expertise. So at this time, let's shift gears a little bit, and thank you again to both of our panelists for your remarks. And let's move on to the Q&A portion of the session. And again, I will be starting us off by asking a few questions to our panelists, but for the audience in the meantime, the chat will be open for you to begin submitting your questions to our panelists, which we'll then try to address as many as we can afterwards. So my first question for our panelists is, and you've spoken to this a little bit already, but thinking about the environment that we're in today and the realities of immigration that we have today, what do you think are some key principles that a Christian or biblical treatment of immigration should involve? And also, in your view, what are some principles that a just immigration system, maybe independently of a Christian or biblical treatment, must have? And feel free to speak to either or both of these parts of the question as you are comfortable. And maybe we can start with Mr. Rodriguez and then move on to Dean Johnson.
Thank you. I believe that when the Christian values of welcoming the stranger and loving our enemies, our neighbors, and enemies as well, inform our policies, we end up having a more humane system. I believe that every immigration system should begin by acknowledging the God-given dignity and worth and civil rights of all people who desire to contribute to the country and come in. It needs to focus on the careful attention and protection of migrant children and their well-being. Christian ethics has always been known for definitely protecting children. The safety of the citizens and of the country's sovereignty, but through non-discriminatory and humane enforcement systems. You have to take into consideration the workforce and the economic needs of the country. The protection and care and right of due process for refugees and asylees without prejudice to creed, race, and political party. And there's one basic principle that's called the non-refoulement principle in international law, which means that the guarantee that no person will be deported to a country where they could face torture and persecution. And I think the importance of family and family unity and the accountability of immigration enforcement agencies and its officials as well should be a part of that system.
Thank you. Mr. Johnson, Dean Johnson.
I'll try to be brief. I agree with all of that. I think that fairness and equality and rationality should be the foundations for our immigration laws. I worry because there's so much in the public discussion of immigration that is just factually inaccurate and can't lead to rational decision-making. For example, the claim that immigrants are criminals and bring crime to this country is just misplaced. If you look at social science study after social science study, you'll see that immigrants as a whole, including undocumented ones, commit crimes on a lesser scale than native-born US citizens. So actually you could make the argument that if you want to decrease crime, you should increase immigration, not decrease immigration. But still some leaders denigrate immigrants as criminals, and particularly immigrants from certain countries as criminals. I also agree wholeheartedly that we should try to remove the stain of race for our immigration laws. I gave a talk last week before the American Bar Association about discrimination against Black immigrants by police as well as immigration officials. We have an immigration system that primarily relies on the criminal justice system to round people up. And if you have a criminal justice system in states and cities across the country that discriminates against African Americans and Latinos, you're going to end up with a removal system that deports Black immigrants in disproportionate numbers and Latino immigrants in disproportionate numbers. And that's exactly what we have today.
Great, thank you. And yeah, and certainly to that point about sort of the, there's a lot of misinformation or misunderstanding running around about migration. As someone who's worked on a little bit of that research myself, and actually have a paper on refugees actually turning out to not increase crime in any appreciable way in the United States, I can certainly identify with that. And actually, that was that was my next question. In fact, was that I've often run into even well-educated, well-meaning colleagues who are misinformed about some really basic aspects of the immigration system or the immigrant experience. And so, and Dean Johnson, you've certainly already spoken to this a little bit, but I want to ask, what is the biggest misconception about immigration that you encounter, or things that you wish people understood, and maybe why those misconceptions exist in your opinion? Maybe Dean Johnson, you'd like to speak to that, and then Mr. Rodriguez.
Sure, I think the one I mentioned is crime is one of them, and it's one that certainly animated President Trump and many of his followers in trying to crack down on Mexican immigration and criminal aliens. But also, and I want to be clear, this is not just a President Trump issue. President Obama deported more non-citizens than any president in United States history. 90% of them were Latino. And he said that the focus was on gangbangers. And that wasn't really the case, because if you looked at the data, you see that all kinds of people got caught up in the dragnet, including people with driver's license issues and traffic issues. Here in Sacramento, a woman who was undocumented, who was selling tamales in front of Walmart, was picked up for trespassing because Walmart didn't like the competition, and ends up in removal proceedings. Those aren't gangbangers. Those are people trying to scrape out a life, and I think that that misconception probably bothers me the most. I think the idea that immigrants are a sap on our economy, and you probably can speak better to this than I can, but looking at the economic studies, it appears that immigrants overall benefit the economy, and certainly in the 1990s led to low inflation and one of the most rapid growths in our economy in US history. There are some costs to some immigrants, including state and local public services, but immigrants also pay an incredible amount in taxes, state and local taxes, obviously. And it's often goes unsaid that immigrants contribute mightily, including undocumented immigrants, to the federal tax base. Immigrants can pay taxes. Undocumented immigrants can pay taxes using a tax identification number. Many of them do, hoping that at some point in time they can become regularized and legal. At the same time, undocumented immigrants aren't eligible for many tax benefits given out by the US government, like the earned income tax credit and things like that. But there's, undocumented immigrants do pay taxes. They pay sales taxes. They pay real estate taxes. The claim that they're a drain on our economy just isn't factually based. Both of those, crime and economics, are big animators for anti-immigrant sentiment. As an educator, I feel horrible that me and my ilk haven't been able to get the word out there.
Absolutely. Mr. Rodriguez?
Yes, I was thinking, and I think that one of the most that I really focus on is the fact that the overwhelming majority of immigrants don't want to come to the United States out of pleasure, bad faith, or just because they want to live off our social government programs. Every time I interview an immigrant, I like to ask at the end of the interview, like, if you had this opportunity, the same opportunities or system in your country, would you come to the United States? And the answer was like 95% is no. And so, in fact, if asylum seekers and immigrants had the same level of safety, security, and freedom, they would not have made the decision to flee or come to the United States. So it's not a decision like I decided, you know what, I'm going to take a vacation, and it's not like that. And sometimes I think that I start the conversation with someone, and that's the mindset that I have to try and engage in my conversation. The other one is that I think it's time to recognize, and probably you could talk more about this than me, but it's time to recognize that one of the main economic advantages the U.S. has always had over the rest of the countries in the world and has allowed our economy to grow is the influx of new immigrants. And I think that's why immigration reform is crucial for the future of our country's economy, the median age, and the longevity of our social programs. So in a sense, we're a capitalistic society, and I'm not an economist, but I know that we need new blood poured into it to expand, because that's the whole purpose of the economy. So I really wanted to, there's a lot of people who really take pride in the economy and everything, but whenever you take them to this point, or you shoot this idea to them, they're completely blown off, or they don't like it. But it's just a matter of growing, right? And another perspective, this is not a misinformation, but something that I've been entertaining recently in a conversation, was that the other is that the US, Europe, and China can't expect to reap the benefits of globalization by concentrating massive amounts of capital and controlling the means of production of the world, by destroying local businesses in the world, and not expect to experience the backlash of globalization. Immigrants to the US has always been immigration to the US has always been the consequence of different events in the world that have really pushed that immigration to the United States. So as long as you know those three, this is my belief, as long as you have those three pillars in front of you, whenever you start a conversation, you can then talk about immigration with a more, you can have a more intelligent conversation on immigration.
Yeah, absolutely. And I certainly agree with both of your points about the economics of immigration, and certainly in the sense that, immigration has been the lifeblood of the U.S. economy in many ways, in both terms of labor as well as innovation, increasingly in recent years. So certainly I appreciate that perspective. Maybe talking about sort of a more, we've been talking about sort of the macro levels of immigration a little bit, and thinking a little bit more about the micro side. We've heard a little bit earlier from the video with Daniela, who is someone who immigrated not for fun, but for reasons that were certainly external to her. Me as well, even growing up as an immigrant myself, not necessarily for fun, but for educational reasons and for opportunity reasons. And growing up as a young immigrant, I thought I was fortunate to be generally surrounded by inclusive people, well-meaning people, natives. But I remember still sometimes feeling like there was a distance between my family and those around us. And I think Danielle also spoke to that a little bit about the difficulty of assimilation and being accepted by those around her. And so I want to ask, in your view, what are some practical things that we can do for and with our neighbors, immigrant neighbors here and now? And maybe in the interest of time, I guess just like one thing each, to hear from you would be great. So maybe Mr. Rodriguez first, and then Dean Johnson.
Yes, it's going to be very simple. Be present in their lives. You don't have to know everything, but an ear to listen goes a long way. That's something that I've learned. During these MPP proceedings, that asylum seekers were just waiting for their cases to resume. Sometimes all they needed was an ear, a person that could sit down and listen to them, and listen to their stories. We talk a lot about God's presence, but our presence, pointing to our Lord's presence, says more about our faith and our ethics than anything else we can say. And caring. I think immigrants want to know that you care about them and people like them. True story from one of CBF's field personnel, which is the name we use for missionary, Sue Smith. She shared with me that she was assisting a Central American asylum seeker, and when she expressed that she was a Protestant Christian, the asylum seeker's response to her was, "Aren't you the one who hates us? Aren't you the ones who wants us outside of your country?" And so it is important to bear in mind that we should love our neighbor when we visit their countries on a mission trip as much as we love them when they arrive into our country. So we're called to do both in the name of Jesus. And I think that's very important. Be present and care not just for them, but care about their issues and their people.
Yeah, thank you. Dean Johnson.
Yeah, I'll be very brief. I think, focus on the government. I think that our government has failed to ensure effective and easy immigrant integration into the United States. A couple of easy things the government could do: make naturalization easier and more accessible, and ensure that more English language programs were available.
Great. And I guess as my last question before we move on to the audience questions, I want to very simply ask, what is it that gives you hope as you live in this field of immigration, as you work here, as you observe what's going on? What is something that has you hoping for the future? And maybe we'll start with Dean Johnson this time, and then Mr. Rodriguez.
I could go on this topic for a long while, but one of the most exciting social movements of the 21st century, the immigrant rights movement, and immigrants, including undocumented immigrants, organizing, taking to the streets, and pushing for positive political change. Wasn't that long ago when President Bush said that undocumented immigrants were living in the shadows of American social life? Now we have young people, dreamers, DACA recipients, and others who are pushing the envelope, who are pushing agendas for things like abolish ICE and to totally transform immigration enforcement. I don't think ICE is going to be dismantled tomorrow, but I think that the only way that our immigration laws are going to change is going to be through political activism and pushing for change. And in my estimation, that's the most exciting hope that I have, this social activism of young people and their supporters.
Yeah. Mr. Rodriguez?
Yes, and thank you to Dr. Professor Johnson's words. They're great, and that gives me hope as well. But another thing that gives me hope is the immigrants' energies. I mean, their desire to support and contribute to our society, their motivation to grow and maximize the benefits of our system. Sometimes I think that they embody the American values more than a lot of people who say that they embody those values, because they have more faith in the system and in the future. They have more faith in America after living in their countries and where they could not excel, and it is great for our faith too. I totally believe that we're going to see a multi-ethnic American church, that is going to become increasingly like John's vision in Revelations 7:9. People from every nation, tribe, and language, and so that as well gives me hope. Um, and like Professor Johnson said, I think that there are more young advocates this time, and that are really pushing the envelope and are talking and really organizing. Like probably I'm not. I mean, I haven't lived that long to know what has happened in the past, but I can I can feel the energy and I can see it as well.
Yeah. Yeah, and certainly uplifting to think about those things and to think about the energy that's coming from a new generation and sort of the prospect of real change that we might see in the near future. So yeah, thank you both. So at this time, we'll move on to the audience Q&A. Looks like there's a pretty good number of questions coming in. And so let me try to pick out a few of these. And I think, maybe we'll have, either of you as you're interested or able to speak to these questions. And, it certainly doesn't have to be both, so please feel free to jump in to respond to these questions. So one question that we've gotten is, and you've both spoken a little bit about the Citizenship Act of 2021 just introduced in the House. And the question was, can you tell us some of the main tenets of this Citizenship Act of 2021?
I can talk about it briefly. It's a very long, lengthy bill. It's only the beginning of the discussion of immigration reform. It would include some kind of path to legalization for the 11 million undocumented immigrants in this country. It would include a speedier path to legalization for some DACA recipients and for some recipients of temporary protected status, which includes many Haitians and Salvadorans. It would tinker with the legal immigration provisions to expand some access. It would change, as I mentioned before, change the terminology from aliens to non-citizens. I think the biggest issue and one of the most difficult ones will be a path to legalization, because that's been attacked as an amnesty, unjustified amnesty in the past, and it's a key demand of immigrants' rights activists. It is funny to me that when we talk about parking ticket amnesties, gun amnesties, tax amnesties, there's not a lot of complaints, but when we talk about amnesties for people, every complaint imaginable comes out of the woodwork. So it's going to be bitterly contested.
Yeah, I agree with that. It is a lengthy bill. It's 353 pages. I have not finished reading it since Thursday. Bear in mind that I just got my power on Thursday in the morning. So, but in reality, it also, not just to what the professor was saying, it also creates not just a path to legalization for them, but also to agricultural workers and temporary protected, those with temporary protected status, just to add that. And as well, the bill focuses on addressing the root causes of migration from Central America by providing some funds to Central American countries. And at the same time, it clears the employment and family visa backlogs and recaptures some unused visas And in the case of employment-based immigration, it eliminates the per country caps. And when it comes to the family-based visas, it increases the caps. So in reality, it kind of opens up the possibility for more immigrants to come in. But I think it's going to be an uphill battle in the Senate. And so let's see what happens.
Yeah, thank you for sort of those details about the plan coming, as well as your thoughts about the prospects of what we might see. So it's great. Another question that came in is that, is there more community regulating or regulation, I guess, within not only immigrant communities, but also minority populations in general? So I think if I'm interpreting this correctly, sort of talking about the role of immigrant communities or enclaves, and sort of people sort of helping each other out, and sort of yeah, in a sense, sort of regulating each other. Maybe this sort of connects to those points about lower crime rates and things like that among immigrant populations. So if that sort of makes sense, wonder if either of you want to speak to that.
To be honest, I don't know what the question really was, but when it comes to whether the immigrants communities are kind of like self-policing, is that what I'm trying to guess? At least I know that the Venezuelans and Cubans, from my perspective and from my knowledge, working with them and belonging in organizations and groups, chats and on organizations with them, they are very strict. Whenever one of their own tries to come to the United States and kind of abuse, if that's how they portray it, the immigration system, the asylum system, and they discourage that person whenever they know that that person is trying to take any advantage. I don't know if that talks a little bit about the question, but at least that's been my experience, at least from Cubans and Venezuelans.
I do think that immigrant enclaves have been instrumental in helping immigrants survive and integrate into American society. One of the claims made by some is that the immigrants failed to assimilate. But I do think that there's a strong set of facts showing that tend to live in enclaves where they can live with people of similar cultures, religions, languages, and where they get that mutual aid and support that allow them to succeed. So the claim really that they fail to assimilate fails to recognize that they're trying to come up with a system for survival in a place that doesn't provide a lot of public support.
Yeah, absolutely. The environment that they face is quite different from, I think, what people may imagine that looks like. So I guess I realize that we're running a little bit over on time, and so I do apologize for that. So I guess maybe I'll just pick one last question to sort of close us out. There's a question that says, if you're advising the Biden-Harris administration, where is a low-hanging fruit for improving unjust conditions in the immigration system?
I think that the low-hanging fruit is changing what is known as the Secure Communities program that makes it easy to require state and local governments to provide any non-citizen arrested to federal authorities and put them in the immigration machinery. The Obama administration tried to change that program and did for a while, but the Trump administration brought it back. But the criminal removal machinery is the biggest part and contributes to 90% of all removals in the United States. And that's the place where I'd start if I wanted to change what's going on immigration enforcement wise.
I totally agree. I don't have anything else to say, because that would be that's a low-hanging fruit in reality that would really change how the immigration officials enforce the law. So I totally agree with that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that is all going to be all the time that we have for the Q&A tonight. Thank you again, Dean Johnson and Mr. Rodriguez, for the wonderful discussion, sharing from your depth of experience. And thank you to the audience and the organizers for helping to make the session so great and for having me here. So with that, let me hand this back off to Gloria.
Yes, thank you so much, Dean Johnson, Mr. Rodriguez, and Dr. Bay for such an enlightening discussion.